that we recorded it during this year's Big Camp, which was a great Christian convention here in New South Wales. And we got the opportunity to speak to John Addis about syntropic gardening. So you're going to be having this interview being played in a few moments. But before that, Lawson has a great announcement to make.
Yeah, hashtag bridge is the code word for A Bridge Across Time. This is a fantastic book getting into, why people come to the belief that they should keep the commandments, and particularly that of the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. If you want this book absolutely for free, hashtag bridge to 0491 064 669.
And now in the studio here with me, I have a very special guest coming for the second time, my good friend John Addis. John, welcome to the Breakfast Show. Thank you so much for being here today again.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
John, last time you came, you were sharing your testimony, how you grew up in England, you moved to Australia at about the age of 20, you were a dancer, you were a plant-based chef, and then you married this girl that you met in your dancing classes, and 15 years later, unbeknownst to you, she grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, but only when you're studying, when you were enrolling your children at the school, that you were introduced to Jesus in a way that you haven't been before. And that exposure to Jesus and to people who were really the hands and the feet of Jesus into your life. You mentioned a friend that was helping you, that you say, you know what, I want to be a part of that people. I want to have a God like this one.
Yeah, you coined it pretty well. That's
so, but you told me a little bit about this other phase of your life, which was syntropic agroforestry or agriculture. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What is when you say syntropic agroforestry? What is that big word that is, I would say, would be brand new to a lot of people's vocabulary?
Okay. So I think it's Newton's law of thermodynamics. It's like it's entropy. So there's a place in the world where everything reaches its potential and then all falls into decay and breaks down, and there's this never-ending cycle of death.
Okay.
That's entropy.
Entropy is, okay. It's the system. I think that I looked at the dictionary at one stage, and it's the entropy is the tendency that systems have to become disorganized and to deteriorate over time.
As we see in nature.
Yes.
All break down, but and it's a pretty pessimistic view of the world. Sure, it happens, but syntropy is the opposite to that. So syntropy is the ever-growing and ever-expanding ways of the world, not the world, of the universe.
So it's basically a system or something that gets better over time.
Yeah,
instead of getting
it
worse.
grows, it becomes more abundant, its growth increases, it doesn't decay and fall into disarray, it's not disorganized, it becomes organized, it grows, it continues to grow, it produces, it's abundant. Abundant is probably the word that's quite used a lot. Yeah.
And where can we find that in nature?
Well, you can find it generally. This was mimicked mainly off nature, what we see in nature, in God's creation, but it was from those systems that really work well. So we're looking at rainforest systems, really flourishing rainforest systems, where those have developed to a degree where it's just so healthy and so producing for itself. In this case, it's not necessarily producing food, but it's producing, and it's got life through it. It's got all the wildlife, and it's all cared for in that sense, and it's ever caring for itself. It doesn't need fertilizers from the outside, but it's got such a high health in terms of soil health, in terms of environmental health, in terms of wildlife. They're all thriving within that system. So a man who created it looked at this kind of system. His name was Ernest Gotch, and he was a Swiss biochemist, engineer, something like that, worked with plants and realized that, trying to kill plants and doing all these sort of things and disease resistance and building up this was, not really the answer. And that's when he came up with this idea of a syntropy, in order to have plants and put them all into a system or an organization that work together.
Okay.
Really well.
So let me see if I'm tracking this right. So you're saying, look, when you look at rainforests, there's something that happens there that's different from our traditional garden, because in our traditional garden, you're planting stuff and you're taking from the soil. At some point, our soil gets depleted, so you need to get outside help, fertilizer, just throw in there, and hopefully that will keep generating, food and other plants that we want. Yeah. But in the rainforest, as time goes by, they have more life, more animals, more plants, more biomass, better soil. And that man that you mentioned, Ernst, he's asking, hey, you know what? Why don't we look into that, how to make the soil better and stronger, as opposed to being investing our time in genetically engineering and modifying plants so that they are more drought resistant, so that they can, just do better with less and less nutrients. Why not pose the problem in a different way?
That's right. Yeah.
So what happened then? So he came up with this question, and is it even possible to replicate those the rainforest dynamics? Because the rainforest there's hundreds and if not thousands of different species per square kilometer.
And there's lots of different types of rainforests: dry, wet, tropical, subtropical. I think there's even temperate rainforests. There's all sorts of different forests you can get, rainforests you can get, but generally they're the most flourishing systems or inhabitant areas or ecologies that we have on this world. So is it possible? Not perfectly. Possibly.
Okay.
I've tried, and Ernst does a great job, and there's many great farms around the world. Brazil mainly, lots of it in Australia, and they're amazing to work on. That's what I do full time. But to follow God's pattern is a challenge. He does the best job of it, but his timeline's not ours. We like to get things a little faster.
What are some of the principles? So how can we mimic God's design of rainforests? What are the principles that we have observed that happen in a rainforest that we can try to mimic or to replicate in food production for ourselves?
Okay, so we want to create an environment that is growing and ever getting better, increasing in its value. And in this case, a lot of that has to do with soil health. I think probably number one would be soil health.
Okay.
And so we're building soil. We're building soil health, and we're increasing that soil health. And the way we do that is by introducing plants. So you can chuck fertilizer all you want, but that fertilizer is going to get used up and get disappeared. So you actually need something that's living in the soil that's going to create more life. Does that make sense? You need life to create more life. And so we are planting plants that are what many people call pioneers. They're the beginning plants. They like to use the word placenta rather than separate it from the actual body of the plant or the system. So there's a placenta. We're using these plants that the first ones that do the job to pave the way for the next plants to come along. So each time that new plant grows and has its life cycle and it produces something, gives back. That's its job. And we help it to give back by pruning it, cutting it, choosing whether it stays or goes, when to plant the next. And so it produces and creates soil life to another degree. Then the next set of plants come along and they do the same job, but each time we're incrementally building life. We're building soil life in this case.
Look, there's two things that are already coming to my mind here. Number one, when we look at the Bible, the Garden of Eden, Adam is described to look after the garden, and this professional of gardener was called in the Bible that he was a tiller of the soil. Like almost like a carer of the soil. And it's very interesting because you're saying here that it's all about looking after the soil. The soil is the most important thing. So what you're saying here, the syntropic agroforestry is basically we are stewards of the soil. We want to make sure that the soil is containing the greatest amount of life. And to do so, it's not just by dumping a whole bunch of chemicals developed during World War II and say, hey, let's just dump them in the soil.
Or non-chemicals, even just,
or not chemical, natural versions. But you're saying, look, actually, there are plants that if you plant them, their job is to actually increase or make the soil better. So can you give me an example of plants? Let's say that we're starting with a soil that is just very poor. Just doesn't really grow anything interesting. It just struggles to grow anything like that. What are the kinds of plants? Just to give us an example, that when planted, they produce something for the soil.
Okay, so a lot of those plants are actually what we know as weeds. So when weeds, even including grass and things like that. So if you clear a patch of soil, or it's been degraded, and you can see a patch of soil out on the ground, and it's just dry and cracking and stuff like that. And, it's pretty sad to look at. Maybe a parking lot or something like that, just constantly getting driven over. If you left that patch of soil and you watched it over time, eventually, depending on how bad that soil was compacted or how much abuse it had, it would start getting covered slowly and slowly. And the first plants that would come back would more than likely be grasses. Maybe in between that, you start to see some of the more weedy species that woodier, kind of ligamentous species that would come back.
Okay.
So it depends on which area you're in. So lantana is a classic example in our area. Lantana is a classic example. So
lantanas are that big bushy plant that gives those small, tiny little pink and yellow flowers.
That's the one, and the bane of many Australian farmers, especially in this area. So it was introduced, I think it's a South American thing. I don't know why. But, whenever there's a clearing in the forest around where we live, we might take a tree down, we might use it for some purpose, or building or burning, or it may have just fallen by its natural way. It creates a little clearing in the forest, and one of the first things to come back is lantana. There's enough light for that lantana to thrive. Now, the lantana is a leguminous plant. It fixes nitrogen. And if you ask anybody who lives on that coast who has some idea about soil, they say, what's the quality of that soil underneath that lantana? Oh, it's always black and it's lush and it's beautiful. Lantana does a really good job of doing
that. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyone who who observes and lives in that area for that long and has an interest, you will see, and they will all say the same. Yeah, wow, that's an amazing thing, and lantana does an amazing job. We wouldn't necessarily.
Who would have
use
thought that lantana was actually it's there and it's blessing the soil?
Well, there's the blessing. I mean, it's not an accident that these things come about. It has to regenerate from something, and it needs a good, vigorous, strong pathway to regenerate. Yeah.
So focusing on the soil is one of the, and using plants to bring life to the soil through various ways that you mentioned, like, maybe pruning them, putting them back. It's one of the principles of syntropic gardening or how forest works. Because, in forest you have leaves falling down all the time and trees coming down and they're being reintegrated into the soil. Yeah. What is another principle from syntropic?
So we'll just build on that. I just want to make a statement here. Lantana, that's its job. We wouldn't necessarily use that in a syntropic system because it can be a bit crazy, but we would use a plant that does a similar job.
Okay.
That's more manageable. Same as we wouldn't use grasses. We do use grasses, but to a degree. It depends on the type. We don't want this creeping, crazy nut grass or something that you can't ever get rid of, especially to begin with. So we choose other plants that do the same job, but are easier to manage. We use pigeon pea, crotallarias, pineapple, cassava, things like that. And then we just, from there, we build onto the larger plants, your eucalypts, and that's controversial. We'll go into that another time. That's what I'm saying. So all these plants, as they start to grow, we plant all these seeds and all these plants at the same time, and they come up in their time when they're ready to grow. And that soil condition will dictate when it's ready. So, first of all, those grasses are coming up. Then the next is going to pop up when the soil is just right. The next plant, it could be your pigeon pea, it could be your crotalaria, could be whatever you could put in there. It could be a local weed, it could be a noxious weed. You kind of manage those. And then eventually you're going to get some woody plants growing there. And that's kind of what we're looking for. And we're looking for lignous sort of carbon things, trees, wood, branches, things that are carbon based. And that's what we want to add to the soil. We need to create soil. Soil needs to have carbon in it. It needs to have houses. They're basically houses for life to live in. So we're life like microbes, even things that make fertility, things that make fertilizer naturally. And that's what we're looking to make. So we keep on chopping and dropping. We're allowing these plants to grow. We're cutting them down. We're pruning them. We're dropping that onto the soil. And some of them are sacrificial plants. And slowly that soil is getting covered. It's getting looked after. It's not getting bleached by the sun. It's then got all those little places for life to live in. The life is breaking it down. The fungus is breaking it down. The soil is starting to become soil, starting to become really good life. And then things can happen. Then magic can happen, as we see here where we are at Stuart's Point.
Wow.
It's a syntropic garden. And from then on, things start to grow. And now we've got this point where we've got avocados. After 3 or 4 years, avocados are brimming underneath the canopy at the moment.
And just to give a context, that I know that garden I was part of helping to set up, 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I remember people laughing. I had one friend of mine he was a farmer himself. And I said, yeah, we're planting, avocados and lemons and whatnot. And they were just like, yeah, you call me when you have an avocado here. And but I'm not going to hold my breath because the soil tell us a little bit about the soil. How was the soil there? I remember the soil was just absolutely shocking. Okay. It was basically pure sand.
So we're out at Stuart's Point. The Adventists have a campground down here, and they run a yearly annual event called Big Camp. And one Big Camp, I met Joseph and his wife Camilla, and she had organized
It's like kind of like a workshop / working bee, really.
That's right. It's a workshop working bee, introducing people to growing, basically. And they had a person here, Addis, who was a bit knowledgeable. His father was a syntropic gardener in Brazil for like 20 or 30 years, goodness knows, maybe longer. Really lovely man, I've met him. And they were putting it in, and I turned up and started taking on from there. But to get back to the story, it's just sand here.
It was sand. It was pretty much pure sand.
Yeah.
And now we have avocados and bananas and dragon fruit and lemons.
We have citrus, oranges, lemons. They're not producing yet. They were put in last year. Avocados are starting to produce.
Avocados are starting to produce.
We have about 10 bananas all fruiting at the moment.
Wow.
All ready to harvest. People are like, when are we going to harvest that? And so we got bananas. Mainly there's bananas coming out at the moment. I had some tamarillos the other day. What else? Pineapples are just about to come on. There's some big ones,
I remember like having like turmerics and gingers and all of that from like very poor soil, which is basically sand. But because we apply those principles of persevering, of adding to the soil, adding composting and leaves and twigs and like organic matter, slowly that sand became fertile enough to generate, to be able to produce more complex forms of life.
That's right.
That case,
we gave it a kickstart, we have to say. So we had someone who made compost on site, large volumes of it. Not the best compost, but compost nevertheless. Broken down, woody materials. We buried a lot of wood, put a lot of wood along the side. We actually really actively helped it to get a good start in life. We actually put some good stuff on there, and we put a lot of time and effort. That kick-started what we've got growing, and we don't do that anymore. So we don't put anything else in there anymore. We just use the trees. We don't water it. Hasn't been watered for 2 years.
Wow.
It's growing continuously.
Wow.
We have been blessed with good weather, rainy weather.
But it survived some pretty hectic drought periods as well.
Well, it's not as wet down here as it is up north. So you get, especially in the winter, long periods of dry.
And I think that this is a beautiful illustration of what the gospel is like, because often we can look at our own lives and we see, man, this is just like a patch of dry ground. There's nothing good really coming out of it. Yeah. And then when we start to feed ourselves with the word of God, slowly but surely things are starting to change. We're starting to grow, and before we know, God is making our lives a lush forest of goodness, of fruits, of the fruits of the Spirit. And so the same principles that apply to spiritual life, they also apply to garden, because God is the creator of one and all, of both of these things. And it's really amazing to see how when we apply God's design of, in this case, a forest, how we can actually reap so much fruit even out of the parchest